Have you ever wondered if we are in a recession right now in 2024? To answer this question, we need to take a look at the general state of the economy. The health of an economy is not determined by a single factor, but a multitude of indicators that collectively paint a picture of our economic landscape. Today, we'll be examining three key indicators: the unemployment rate, the inflation rate, and the gross domestic product or GDP growth rate. First off, the unemployment rate. This is the percentage of the workforce that is jobless and actively seeking employment. It's a critical gauge of economic health because when more people are working, they have more income to spend, driving economic growth. Conversely, high unemployment can signal a struggling economy. Next up, the inflation rate. This measures the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising. A moderate amount of inflation is expected in a growing economy. However, if inflation gets too high, it can create uncertainty and erode purchasing power. On the flip side, very low inflation can lead to a slowdown in economic growth. Lastly, we have the GDP growth rate. This represents the pace at which the total output of goods and services in an economy is increasing. It's essentially a measure of economic growth. A positive growth rate indicates that the economy is expanding, while a negative growth rate might suggest that the economy is contracting, a potential sign of a recession. In 2024, these indicators are telling us a story. The unemployment rate is at a certain level, the inflation rate is moving in a specific direction, and the GDP growth rate is either positive or negative. But what does this all mean? How do these numbers translate into the everyday lives of people and businesses? Well, to fully understand the tale these indicators are telling, we need to delve deeper into each one, to understand not just what they are, but also what they imply about the health and future of our economy. Now that we have an overview of the current economic landscape, let's delve deeper into each of these indicators. The unemployment rate is a key indicator of economic health, but what does it really mean? Unemployment, in simplest terms, refers to the proportion of the workforce that is jobless and actively seeking employment. But the calculation isn't as straightforward as it may seem. To calculate the unemployment rate, we divide the number of unemployed individuals by the total number of individuals in the labor force, then multiply that by 100 to get a percentage. The total labor force includes both employed and unemployed individuals, but not those who are retired, studying, or unable to work. Now let's consider the current unemployment rate. It's been hovering around a certain percentage. To put this into perspective, let's compare it with the unemployment rate of the past few years. During periods of economic boom, the unemployment rate was considerably lower. Conversely, during economic downturns, it spiked. But how does the unemployment rate relate to a recession, you might ask? A recession is typically characterized by a significant decline in economic activity, spread across the economy, and lasting more than a few months. One of the main indicators is a high unemployment rate. When businesses start to feel the pinch of an economic downturn, they often resort to layoffs to cut costs. This leads to an increase in the number of people looking for work, thus driving up the unemployment rate. A high unemployment rate is not just a statistic, it represents real people facing economic hardship. However, it's important to remember that the unemployment rate is not the be-all and end-all indicator of a recession. It's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Other factors, including the inflation rate and GDP growth rate, also play crucial roles in painting the full economic picture. So while a high unemployment rate can indeed be a sign of a struggling economy, it's vital to look at it in conjunction with other economic indicators. After all, understanding the health of an economy requires a holistic view. So a high unemployment rate can be a sign of a struggling economy, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the economic puzzle is the inflation rate. But how does it affect you and me? Well, the inflation rate is a measure of the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising, and subsequently, purchasing power is falling. In essence, it's a way to gauge how much less your money can buy compared to a previous time period. This rate is typically measured over a year and is expressed as a percentage. For instance, with an inflation rate of 2%, a loaf of bread that cost $1 last year would cost $1.02 this year. So what's the current state of play? Our inflation rate for the past year has been hovering around 3%. When compared to the previous few years, this is a bit higher. In the years 2021 and 2022, the inflation rate was around 2%. But why should we care about a 1% increase? Well, while a single percentage point may not sound like much, when applied to an entire economy, it can have significant effects. Higher inflation can lead to increased costs for businesses, which may then be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Moreover, when inflation rates are high or rising rapidly, it can indicate an unhealthy economy. It could signal that demand for goods and services is outpacing supply, or that too much money is chasing too few goods. This can lead to an economic bubble, and when that bubble bursts, a recession may follow. However, it's crucial to remember that inflation isn't inherently bad. Some level of inflation is actually healthy for an economy. It encourages spending and investment, as people are less likely to hold on to money when its purchasing power is falling. In conclusion, inflation affects us by slowly eroding our purchasing power. A dollar today may not buy as much tomorrow. But remember, while inflation is an important economic indicator, it's not the only one we need to keep an eye on. Inflation can erode our purchasing power, but it's not the only indicator we need to consider. Now, let's turn our attention to the GDP growth rate. It's often seen as the most comprehensive measure of an economy's health. At its core, the gross domestic product, or GDP growth rate, is a measure of economic activity within a country. It's the annual percentage change in the value of all goods and services produced in a nation. This calculation takes into account everything from the sandwich you bought for lunch to the latest blockbuster movie. So, when we talk about GDP growth rate, we're really talking about the pace at which a country's economy is growing or shrinking. As of now, the GDP growth rate is a figure that's sparking a lot of discussion. Compared to the past few years, it's showing some interesting trends. To understand this, let's take a short trip down memory lane. 5 years ago, the economy was in a different phase, expanding at a brisk pace. Fast forward to today, and the growth rate has slowed down considerably. This change in pace is not necessarily a bad thing. It could mean our economy is simply transitioning from a period of rapid expansion to a more sustainable, albeit slower, growth rate. However, if the GDP growth rate dips into negative territory, that's when we start hearing the word recession. A negative growth rate means the economy is contracting, not growing. This could be due to various factors such as decreased consumer spending, lower investment, or even a global economic downturn. But remember, a single year of negative growth doesn't necessarily mean we're in a recession. Typically, economists look for a pattern of decline over several quarters. It's like a puzzle. One piece doesn't give you the whole picture, but several pieces together start to form a clearer image. The GDP growth rate gives us a big picture view of the economy, but it's important to consider all these indicators together. After all, understanding the health of our economy isn't just about one number, it's about how all these figures interact and what story they collectively tell. So, with all these indicators in mind, are we in a recession in 2024? Let's take a step back and consider the bigger picture. We've been discussing the state of the economy, the unemployment rate and its implications, the impact of inflation, and the GDP growth rate. Now we will combine all this information and attempt to answer the question on everyone's mind. The state of the economy, as we've discussed, involves a complex interplay of various factors. While some indicators might point towards a potentially challenging economic climate, others may suggest a more positive outlook. It is important to remember that these indicators are not always crystal clear, and their interpretations can vary. Considering the unemployment rate, for instance, we've seen an uptick. This could be a cause for concern, as it might indicate a slowdown in economic activity. However, this needs to be considered in conjunction with other factors such as the inflation rate and the GDP growth rate. The inflation rate, another key indicator of economic health, has been relatively stable. This suggests that the purchasing power of the average consumer is not being drastically eroded, which is a positive sign for the economy. Now let's turn our attention to the GDP growth rate. While it has been somewhat sluggish, it hasn't dropped into the negative territory, which would be indicative of a recession. So, are we in a recession in 2024? Based on the current indicators, it seems we are treading cautiously in uncertain waters. There are signs of a potential slowdown, but not a full-blown recession. However, the situation is fluid and can change, as economies are influenced by a myriad of factors, both domestic and international. Understanding these economic indicators can help us make sense of the economic chatter, but remember, economies are complex and predicting them with certainty is no easy task.